So there's a lot on the table now, and that's actually my first point. Jordan has a habit of sandwiching absurd, unfounded, and nonsensical claims between valid, insightful, and humble claims, and his acolytes unfortunately equate the validity, insight, and humility of his bread with his filling.
Well, as someone who spends perhaps an unhealthy amount of time making videos attempting to prove that Jordan Peterson's ideas are anything but word salad, it's probably fair to say that I am exactly the kind of person who Stephen Woodford believes has been duped by the absurd, unfounded, and nonsensical propositions that Jordan Peterson puts forward. And while I honestly do not rule that out as a genuine possibility, given that I am in fact a dumbass, I am going to attempt to illustrate why I believe that Stephen Woodford is at best misinformed and at worst completely backwards in regard to his numerous and sometimes just shy of hyperbolic criticisms of Jordan Peterson. Specifically, Woodford's issue with Peterson's claim that everyone is religious. I'm going to attempt to prove that Peterson's notion of religion as a universal psychological concept is a superior way of conceptualizing religion because it better achieves the aims of diagnosing and addressing ideological fundamentalism and dogma, be it traditional religious dogmatism or secular dogmatism. Here is Peterson's definition of religion along with Woodford's first criticism.
But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious experience. So my first question would be, how do you define what is considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
Religious is what you act out.
What's that?
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So there's the claim. Jordan asserts that your implicit axioms or assumptions are your religious beliefs, and so he's implicitly asserting that since everyone has implicit axioms, therefore everyone has religious beliefs.
It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not.
Or in other words, Jordan asserts that everyone is religious. If we say that religious is what you act out, then all of our actions are religious, and therefore the act of praying 5 times a day, or the mutilation of a child's genitalia to appease a deity, is just as religious as going to the cinema, drinking a glass of water, going for a walk, or taking a dump, which is to say that it's a useless definition and thus nonsensical.
Now, in principle, I get Stephen's point here. Rendering certain words meaningless by broadening their definition too much is a legitimate linguistic concern, one with real consequences. There are Republicans and conservatives who will label any increase in the role of government as being Marxist, and there are those on the far left who will claim any disparity between ethnic groups is the result of racism. The problem is, if everything can be described as racist, then nothing can be described as racist, and we lose the usefulness of that term. I like to call this kind of linguistic terrorism syndrome for obvious reasons.
And when everyone's super, no one will be.
But the thing is, I don't believe Peterson can be legitimately accused of syndrome in this case. The claim that all actions are predicated on a foundational set of implicit axioms doesn't imply that there is utility in describing all actions as equally religious. And this is true even if we ignore Peterson's clarification and just take his radically oversimplified definition at face value. But this isn't even the primary criticism that Woodford makes, as he asserts there's nothing wrong with using new definitions so long as there's valid justification for doing so, which I agree with.
There's nothing inherently wrong with him creating a new definition of religion, but what is wrong is how he uses it.
And here's where I think Woodford's criticism simply falls apart.
The reason he can say that Christianity is true.
I think it's true and not true. The stories are erroneous in detail and right in pattern.
Is because rather than using the colloquial definition of truth, that being that which is in accordance with reality, he's created a new definition of truth, that being that which promotes reproduction.
First off, that which promotes reproduction is a pretty harsh oversimplification of the pragmatist theory of truth put forward by people like William James and utilized by Jordan Peterson. But that aside, I utterly reject the idea that there is a colloquial definition of truth that Peterson is somehow violating. Outside of nerds, philosophy students, and general losers such as myself, no one sits down and articulates a definition of truth. The definition of a term like truth is made implicit in its use, right? Is it true that you're watching this video? Is it true that the color of my shirt is dark blue? It's like, well, technically color doesn't exist in the objective world. It only exists in our subjective perceptions. So to claim if it's true or not, it's like, look, at a certain point, most people don't care. And so this appeal to a colloquial definition of truth is just complete nonsense. There are some concepts that don't need to be defined in order for them to have utility, as psychiatrist and Oxford scholar Ian McGilchrist so eloquently explains when asked to define a term like wisdom.
How would you define wisdom?
I wouldn't necessarily define it at all. I think there are certain things, if you don't know them when you see them, a definition is not going to help you. And indeed, that, of course, is the left hemisphere's idea. Well, let's get this cut and dried and clear at the outset. So what is the soul? What is meant by God? What is, etc. Now, the point is that in areas of very real experience that we all respond to, there are things for which we don't have terms that can be simply defined.
With that in mind, let's continue with Woodford's criticism.
The reason he can say that the Bible is more real than real.
A great novel is more real than real. And a collection of stories like the Bible, that's more real than meta-real.
It's because rather than using the colloquial definition of real, that being having objective existence, he uses an obscure definition of real, that being having conceptual existence.
Again, this doesn't make any sense. Are numbers objectively or conceptually real? What about the laws of logic? You can certainly have a debate about these abstract ideas, but to Google the definition of the most foundational metaphysical concepts that the human mind is capable of abstracting, and then claiming that a deviation from these definitions is somehow nonsensical is, in my opinion, pretty foolish. But this last part of Woodford's criticism, in which he explains the worst part about Peterson, is just completely backwards.
And the reason he can say that everyone is religious
You can't be a non-believer in your action.
is because he's created a new definition of religion that's somehow more vague than the already useless, a pursuit or interest followed with great devotion. On the topic of religion, this is what Jordan does, and it's precisely why I and many others have accused him of language games. And the worst part about it is that he's not at all upfront about the obscure and sometimes entirely made up definitions that he uses until someone essentially forces him to be so. Until that point, most of his Christian followers simply assume that he's using their language, and that he therefore shares their beliefs.
And there it is, the most baseless criticism that atheists like to levy against Jordan Peterson. Yes, I am sure all of the Christian fundamentalists who believe the earth is 6,000 years old are big fans of Peterson shouting at them aggressively that they're swallowing a bunch of lies and hand-waving away basic scientific realities.
Because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that? And if on the fundamentalist side you say, well, we'll try to shoehorn science into this framework, and really that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well with the claims of evolution, for example. In fact, it works very badly. And that's a problem, because evolutionary theory is like, it's a killer theory. And it's really, really hard. And like, it's not a complete theory, and there's lots of things we don't know about evolution, but, you know, trying to hand wave that away, that's not going to work without dispensing with most of biology.
So yes, to Woodford's point, many Christians and religious people do appreciate Peterson precisely because he uses language in a way that does appeal to them. And what's the result? Peterson Trojan horses the theory of evolution into the fundamentalist worldview, thus destabilizing it.
I think that Revelation is a psychedelic account. Literally.
Oh, the book of Revelation.
I really believe that. You bet.
And thereby pushing back against the anti-scientific dogma and harms of religious literalism, which is exactly what atheists like Woodford spend a sizable amount of their time justifiably doing. So, if it is the case that
there's nothing inherently wrong with him creating a new definition of religion,
and his new definition of religion appeals to fundamentalists while at the same time undermining their worldview, then that alone is reason to justify Peterson's claim that everyone is religious, unless there is some other harm that this causes that I am simply not aware of. And additionally, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the postmodern neo-Marxist elephant in the room and point out that Peterson is by no means the only person to identify the secular religiosity that is currently sweeping through the Western world.
Within the religion that I'm talking about, the cardinal point is that you show that you know that racism exists. Just that you know that it exists. Now, what you're going to do about it is irrelevant. Whether or not what you're showing actually is racism is irrelevant. The fact is that you knew you were supposed to be looking for it. And it means that a lot of people look at what goes on with the race scene in the United States. And I know to an extent, there is that in Canada too. Whenever you see these sorts of things happening and you see brilliant people making arguments that don't make any sense and utterly despising those who disagree with them as if they were heretics, word chosen deliberately, it's because what we're seeing, even though these are people who are usually very secular in their self-conception, it's a religion. This is exactly the kind of person who sent Galileo into exile a very, very long time ago. And the people back then often didn't think of themselves as religious. It was just considered truth. We're faced with that same kind of thought, even if the word isn't applied. But all of this stuff only makes sense if you realize that these people are religious and that they have to be treated as parishioners and not as people who are up for an argument.
And if there is one thing I can appreciate about people like Stephen Woodward, it's that, unlike the parishioners of the so-called Church of Woke, most prominent atheists are generally up for an argument, and they almost always offer serious and good faith criticism of people like Peterson. Almost always.
Which is just boneheadedly stupid from a guy who tried to avoid his own addiction consequences by being put into a coma on experimental treatment because he's too much of a fucking narcissist and an egomaniac to actually suffer through the withdrawal. Why the fuck does anybody listen to him? I have zero interest or respect for anything Jordan Peterson ever says.
And so with that, good luck and Godspeed.